The modern airplanes are much easier for the pilot.
Yes.
With the tricycle landing gear. And much easier to land and much easier to maneuver on the ground. Once they get in the air, they all fly basically the same.
And don't you think with the modern equipment it's much more reliable?
I don't think they probably ever built an airplane much more reliable than
the
the
Dakota.
Dakota.
Flying low over the Australian countryside is Shanghai Lil, a fine example of the renowned Douglas Dakota. In 1988, Australian Airlines fully restored Shanghai Lil to the livery it wore during its inaugural flights for the airline in 1946. However, the name Shanghai Lil was adopted in a later livery. After the war, many airlines worldwide relied heavily on these aircraft, known as the DC-3, with DC standing for Douglas Commercial. Most, including Shanghai Lil, built in 1942, were originally military C-47s, C for cargo, converted for civilian use. Nearly 11,000 of these remarkable twin-engine planes were produced, the majority for military purposes, as they were built during wartime. A few Dakotas, however, were originally manufactured as commercial passenger planes, fulfilling the design's original intent. When the U.S. entered the war, these aircraft were deemed too crucial for the war effort to remain as airliners, leading the Army to requisition even those few built for commercial use. Luxury armchairs and other fittings were stripped away, and the airline livery vanished under coats of olive drab paint. The plane's development began in 1932 when Transcontinental and Western Air, TWA, approached the Douglas Company with a request for an airliner that could outperform Boeing's excellent Model 247 passenger plane. TWA had initially sought to purchase the 247, but Boeing's production was dedicated to United Airlines, TWA's main rival, partly owned by Boeing. Douglas took up TWA's challenge, assembling a team to work on the design. They first studied the 247 to identify areas for improvement. Anticipating the availability of powerful new engines from Pratt & Whitney and Wright Aeronautical, they opted for a twin-engine design, despite TWA's original preference for a tri-motor configuration. Relying on advanced engines, the design incorporated established innovations such as the Northrop aerofoil wing, retractable landing gear, and wing flaps to extend wing surface during landings. The resulting aircraft, the DC-1, was unmistakably a precursor to the Dakota. In surpassing the specifications set to rival the Boeing 247, the DC-1 excelled in speed, quietness, operational economy, strength, and passenger capacity. Only one DC-1 was built, but after its loss in a crash, a slightly lengthened model, the DC-2, entered production. When the first DC-2 took to the skies for TWA on May 15, 1934, it immediately attracted inquiries and orders from airlines in the U.S. and Europe. The aircraft revolutionized airline travel, offering unprecedented sophistication and comfort, including the introduction of in-flight movies. The U.S. Army quickly recognized its potential, taking delivery of its first Dakota in 1935 and promptly ordering 2 more. Initially prototypes for testing, these were soon pressed into active service. 18 more followed, equipped with distinctive double cargo doors for the C-47 model, serving not only as transports but also as communication hubs. Douglas adapted the Dakota's wing design and other components to create the B-18 bomber. Though essentially a different aircraft, it retained the efficiency and power of the DC series. The B-18 played a modest role in World War II, mainly as a coastal patrol aircraft. Meanwhile, the commercial aircraft continued to thrive, leading to the development of a new, stretched and wider-bodied variant, the Douglas Sleeper Transport, or DST, designed to offer passengers the comfort of onboard bunks. Dubbed the airborne equivalent of a luxury liner, the DST first flew on December 17, 1935. However, the extra space wasn't limited to sleeping arrangements. Without upper bunk windows, the design could easily be reconfigured as a standard airliner, and in August 1936, the first of these planes, the DC-3, was delivered to American Airlines. With the onset of war, civilian production ceased, giving way to mass production of the C-47. These aircraft served in every theater of war, enduring all conditions and taking on diverse roles. Their operations in New Guinea exemplified their critical importance. On the ground, the Allies and their Japanese adversaries faced an environment where movement was painfully slow, hindered by the thick jungle mud. Only in the air could these harsh conditions be bypassed, and the C-47, nicknamed the Biscuit Bomber, became a significant Allied advantage. Allied troops relied on Dakotas for airdrops, supported by an efficient logistical network to deliver essential supplies to the front lines. From ammunition to food rations, supplies were meticulously packed to endure the impact of airdrops, making the seemingly simple task of packing a vital, life-saving skill. Upon receiving orders, the required materials were swiftly assembled for transport to the waiting C-47s. Pilots were thoroughly briefed to locate the drop zones, often little more than small jungle clearings marked with parachutes from prior drops. At the airfields, the C-47s were quickly and carefully loaded, preparing to take flight for their critical missions. Escorted by fighters, the Biscuit Bombers would take to the skies.
I'm the guy in that P-38. I'm upstairs looking out for trouble.
During the pivotal months when the Pacific War turned against Japan, the combination of the C-47 and the parachute proved instrumental in securing Allied victories in the jungle. ground troops had even more reasons to appreciate the C-47's presence. For many wounded soldiers, survival owed much to the dependable Douglas airliner. C-47s operated as medevac units, evacuating the injured from battle zones to base hospitals, with nurses providing in-flight care. The courage, dedication, and tireless efforts of these young nurses remain a testament to unsung heroism. Even knowing these air ambulances were available likely bolstered the morale of soldiers on the front lines. Meanwhile, the Dakota served both sides in the Pacific, as Japan had begun producing the airliner before the war and continued manufacturing it, fitted with gun turrets for military use during the conflict. Additionally, over 2,000 were built in Russia alongside 700 supplied under Lend-Lease, enabling the Soviets to utilize them extensively for transporting troops and cargo. Here, a Dakota carries a Soviet parachute unit, equipped for operations in the winter snow. A stark contrast to the humid jungles of the Pacific, but performing the same critical role, helping to win the war. Germany's success in developing elite paratroopers, proven in their decisive actions during the Allied rout on Crete, spurred all combatants to create similar units. These soldiers were carefully selected, specially armed, and rigorously trained. Central to their preparation was the daunting task of parachuting, trusting their gear and leaping, heavily burdened with weapons, into hostile territory. Extensive training focused not only on the jump itself, but also on executing safe landings. For most, the aircraft of choice was the reliable C-47, once again rising to the occasion and excelling in its role. Another key method for deploying troops during World War II was the glider, with most glider towing carried out by C-47s. While gliders were fragile and proved to be a risky and unreliable option in combat, the C-47's sturdy fuselage was briefly considered for glider use. However, the idea was quickly abandoned. Common sense prevailed, and the Dakota's immense value made it far too precious to be used as a disposable asset. Tactical air transport wasn't just about moving men, it was about moving machinery. The C-47 was capable of carrying howitzers, various types of armor, and even the iconic Willys Jeep. Throughout the war, its spacious fuselage transported vast amounts of equipment, proving time and again its vital role in the Allied war effort. In countless instances, the Dakota demonstrated its immense value across a wide range of roles, becoming a cornerstone of the Allies' ability to conduct warfare. One task stands out as both the C-47's greatest test and its most significant achievement: its role in Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings at Normandy. The invasion of German-occupied Europe was the largest movement of men and equipment across water ever attempted. In the airborne segment of the operation, the C-47, with its proven efficiency, played a pivotal role. To prevent friendly fire from Allied anti-aircraft batteries, the C-47s were painted with white invasion stripes. They performed three critical tasks: towing gliders, dropping parachutists, and transporting supplies to the invasion forces. Over 1,000 C-47s were deployed on D-Day and throughout the tense weeks that followed. After D-Day, the true cost of using gliders was fully realized, and it turned out to be far higher than expected. While it was anticipated that some gliders, along with their cargo of troops and equipment, would be lost, the actual scale of the losses was staggering. The gliders were theoretically reusable, intended to be recovered and recycled for subsequent use. In practice, however, they were more like disposable items, as many were too damaged to be salvaged. The more significant loss, though, was among the glider pilots, who, sitting at the front of these fragile craft, suffered disproportionately high casualties. These pilots underwent training comparable to that of their powered aircraft counterparts, and in addition, they had to be capable of transitioning from flying to operating as fighting soldiers on the ground. They were a costly investment and difficult to replace. The third major cost was the gliders' inability to effectively deliver a fighting force ready for immediate battle. Instead, they often resulted in high casualties, and many of the soldiers who did survive the crash landings were dazed, confused, and shocked by the violence of the impacts. Additionally, a significant amount of equipment was lost, either with gliders that crashed or those that landed in the wrong location, leaving troops ill-equipped for their mission. Had the Germans been in force as the gliders landed, the outcome could have been disastrous. The gliders were used because they were available, and the true extent of their limitations had not been fully anticipated. Despite their flaws, the courage and training of the troops they carried allowed for limited success in their missions. However, after the disappointing experience at Arnhem, where gliders proved ineffective, their use was abandoned, and more reliable methods were developed for future operations. Like the DC-3, the DC-4 remained in service for many years, often overshadowed by the fame of its smaller cousin, the Skymaster. The DC-4, with its larger size and 4 engines, could cross the Atlantic and enjoyed a successful career. After World War II, the Dakotas might have expected a quieter life, but just a few years later, they found themselves in the thick of another conflict: Korea. In Korea, the Dakotas provided many of the same services they had during the war, but newer models began to take on more specialized roles. Douglas's massive Globemaster, for example, was now handling tasks like transporting armor, missions that the smaller C-47 could never have attempted. The role of parachute carrier was taken on by new, specially designed aircraft, like the Fairchild Packard. Its twin boom tail was designed with a rear exit, specifically for dropping parachutists, whether carrying supplies or troops. As the need for tactical air transport continued to evolve, it reached its peak during the Vietnam War. Despite its age and seeming obsolescence, the C-47 still remained a vital player in that conflict, with only the C-130 Hercules matching it in the variety of roles it could perform. The Hercules, of course, represented an entirely new generation of aircraft, powered by jet engines driving its propellers, but its versatility and ruggedness echoed the very qualities that made the Dakota legendary. Another specialist aircraft developed during this period was the Fairchild Provider, a clever design for assault transport operations. The Fairchild Provider was, in many ways, designed as a powered glider. If necessary, it could be treated as a disposable aircraft. Its wings were specifically designed to shear off upon impact, preventing the plane from spinning out of control as older gliders had done disastrously during the Normandy landings. Fortunately, the Provider rarely needed to make tactical crash landings. As the development of specialist aircraft continued, it became clear that by the time of the Vietnam War, the C-47's era was nearing its end. However, ironically, the C-47's greatest strength was its versatility. There always seemed to be a role for the aircraft, as long as it was still able to fly. In Indochina, one of the Dakota's key uses was in electronic warfare. Here, highly trained technicians boarded specially equipped C-47s, which were often older than most of the crew members. The primary mission of these special flights was to determine the coordinates of enemy radio transmissions from several different locations. Flying low and slow, the C-47 proved to be an excellent platform for pinpointing enemy targets with precision. The gathered intelligence would then be relayed to American bombers, ensuring that the dense Southeast Asian jungle no longer served as an impenetrable shield for enemy troop movements. This type of operation was widely regarded as highly successful. Another key use of the venerable C-47 in Vietnam was in psychological warfare. Winning the hearts and minds of Vietnamese villagers who were constantly under pressure from the Viet Cong became a battle in itself. Convincing members of the Viet Cong to defect was considered a critical objective. Operating on the belief that, in some cases, the pen could be mightier than the sword, millions of pamphlets were printed and scattered over the jungle in an effort to sway hearts and minds. For this type of work, the durable C-47 was likely more suited than anything in the modern inventory. Assessing the effectiveness of psychological warfare is difficult, but it was widely deemed worth continuing for several years. Maintaining the airworthiness of the C-47 was essential, as a crash or even a forced landing in the hostile areas of Vietnam could have dire consequences. In one of the more warlike adaptations of the sturdy Dakota, high-speed Gatling guns with immense firepower were mounted on the aircraft, transforming it into a formidable gun platform. Missions were meticulously planned so that the crew knew exactly which areas were to be saturated with gunfire. The crews took enormous risks, flying at very low altitudes, often under the cover of darkness, to carry out one of the most novel and effective methods of combating concentrations of enemy troops. In this way, many Vietnamese villages and U.S. garrisons were defended. Here, flares are being loaded onto the aircraft, passing by the intimidating muzzle of one of the Gatling guns. Before each strike, senior American officers would coordinate with South Vietnamese officials, briefing them on the mission's intent and reviewing the latest intelligence. Flying into the night, the Dakota's crew would receive the final go-ahead as they navigated toward the target zone. The challenges they faced and the risks they took were deemed worthwhile. The Gatling gun-equipped Dakota was one of the few ways to quickly deploy such intense firepower into an area that could erupt into a trouble spot within hours. Half a century after its first flight, the Douglas Commercial Model No. 3, originally designed to provide TWA a counter to Boeing's aircraft that United Airlines flew, was still finding valuable roles in both civilian and military service. This raises the question, does a truly great design ever become obsolete? Those who served and flew aboard the legendary Dakota would likely have the answer. In 1953, the United States Air Force awarded its highest non-combat civilian decoration, the Exceptional Service Award, to Donald W. Douglas. The citation reads, "Donald Willis Douglas distinguished himself by rendering exceptional service to the United States Air Force and his country through his contribution to the development of military and civilian aviation over the past 40 years. The quality of his technical expertise is most clearly demonstrated by the DC-3, which is undeniably regarded as the best single airplane ever built." This unreserved evaluation of the aircraft remains one that countless people around the world would fully support.
The Junkers Ju-52, affectionately known by those who flew her as Iron Annie, or Auntie U, or simply Auntie. The tri-motored transport, which also served as a bomber, was to become a legend, not only for her longevity, but also for her flexibility. She was in fact as much a symbol of the Luftwaffe as the Stuka and the 109.
The Ju-52 was like the DC-2 and 3, I would say an iconic aircraft because its reliability, it's three-engined aircraft, very, very reliable, and one wonders why they weren't more frequently used in the UK and the USA, three-engine layout, because it was very common in Italy, was used quite widely in Germany, and but you just have rare cases of it in the States, like the tri-motor Ford, but it's a great solution.
The Ju-52 was constructed with the same corrugated material that the Junkers company was to rely upon for over 2 decades, going back almost to the Great War. During this period, aircraft much larger than the 52, such as the Behemoth Junker G-38, also used the same cladding. However, as the 30s came to a close, Junker's corrugated hallmark was starting to look a little tired, especially compared with other foreign types like the American DC-2 and DC-3. Nevertheless, Auntie still stayed in service. The Junkers company had in fact designed a replacement for Auntie prior to the start of World War II. Although they still wanted to retain its trimotor configuration, it was in most other respects a totally new aircraft.
The Ju-252. It was a distinct difference from the very famous Ju-52. It had smooth stressed wings and a very large cargo fuselage capacity. One of the main features about it was it had a wonderful loading ramp, which was operated hydraulically at the back end of the aeroplane. Now, this was a tail-wheel aeroplane, but after landing, the ramp could be operated and would come down and raise the aircraft's tail. And it was absolutely top-notch. And the incredible thing about it was we actually did experiments to see how this thing would react on the airplane in flight. And at the large enemy aircraft exhibition in October of 1945, we flew this aircraft with the ramp fully open, and as a gimmick, we had a chap sitting on one of the lower steps on the ramp, obviously with a harness attached, but he was sitting there pretending to smoke a cigarette. Well, it appealed very heavily to the crowds, and it was quite surprising that this aircraft had this tremendous range of central gravity and was very trimmable in that situation.
The Ju-252 had a stablemate, the Ju-352, which was made largely of wood to reduce the use of aluminum. The Ju-352 proved less successful, although they were the first transport types to use a tailgate ramp that provided a flat surface for loading. Between the two models, only 65 examples were actually produced. When Germany was attacked on two fronts in 1944, they went out of production, as the priority was more fighters to defend the fatherland. Another military transport which used a rear ramp also came from the drafting boards of Junkers. The Ju-290 evolved from the four-engine Junkers 90 airliner, which showed great promise as an advanced design just before the war. The Ju-90 airliner, like most other aircraft of the time, was a tail dragger. So when Junkers created a transport version, they employed the same lifting tailgate developed for the earlier 252. For the time, the Ju-290 transport was a large aircraft when it first came into service in August of 1942.
When I flew the Ju-290, I was very impressed with it in the sense that it had a lovely cockpit layout, a very comfortable layout. It was obviously a civil aircraft adapted to a military role, rather like the Focke-Wulf 200. It was almost similarly armed, not quite so heavily armed as the Focke-Wulf 200, but flew very nicely. And I think it would have made a comfortable, with a little adaptation, a comfortable transatlantic piston engine aircraft in the early days. In fact, after the war, of course, the Americans, they had a group like I had retrieving aircraft, German aircraft after the war. They were called Watson's Whizzers. And Colonel Watson actually flew the Ju-290 back to America via Bermuda. And he was very impressed with it, as indeed I was too.
It was certainly the largest land-based powered aircraft in the Luftwaffe inventory. The type was 8 foot longer than the airliner version had more powerful engines and a very considerable range. It had been claimed, although never proven, that it made direct flights between Germany and Japan. There was also a need for smaller transports, even smaller than Anti-U. This need was filled by the conversion of a medium-sized glider into a powered aircraft. The Gotha 244 became available in 1943, created by the simple addition of 2 small radial engines to a standard production glider. The radials were actually made in occupied France and as such had little impact on German war production. About 130 of the type were made and proved useful in moving small numbers of troops or light vehicles over short distances. Using the same glider to power plane conversion, the massive Messerschmitt 323 was another attempt to maximize the Luftwaffe's airborne assets.
The Gigant, I saw the 4-engine version and the 6-engine version of the Gigant. In fact, I taxied the 6-engine version. It wasn't airworthy, but I taxied it just as a matter of interest. It was a vast airplane, called glider, of course, and the one I taxied was the D model, and it had 6 nnown engines, and the 4-engine one had proved difficult, inadequate number of engines, and still had to have some assisted takeoff, such as JATO, or rocket assistance on takeoff. As pure gliders towed by aircraft like the Heinkel 111Z, they were a failure in my opinion. You had 3 Heinkel aircraft playing around with this, or the large Z, and all of them, the whole thing was a very dicey operation indeed. But once you got the 6-engine version going, it was practicable, but of course, it was a large, sluggish airplane.
Because of its great size and slow speed, the Me-323 was a sitting duck, and many were destroyed by the Allies. But when escorted by fighters, its ability to carry large loads was much valued by the Wehrmacht, especially in the mayhem that became the Eastern Front. Blohm & Voss built another remarkable transport aircraft, a long-range flying boat named the Viking. The BV-222 story is not unlike the Ju-90s. It was originally ordered as a commercial flying boat. However, as the war approached, the Viking evolved into a large military transport, which also performed some patrol duties. 6 powerful engines propelled the Viking. At first they were fueled with gasoline, but the BV-222 was intended to be refueled at sea by submarines. Since U-boats are driven by diesel, the practical solution was to convert the Viking to diesel engines. Blohm & Voss had another prototype flying boat that was even more advanced. The BV-238 was designed to cope with harsher sea conditions than the Viking could handle. Working only with U-boats, it was expected to go on very lengthy missions. It was designed to be almost self-supporting and able to deal with many types of heavy cargo. To assist in loading the 238, it was equipped with a massive forward waterproof door in the bow. This could be employed in a similar manner to landing craft on a beachhead. What you see here is only a service hatch set within the waterproof door. To assist in handling cargo, there were derricks and winches located on the hull, making the BV-238 more like a merchant ship than an aircraft. There was also a tunnel which ran the length of both wings, providing internal access to the 6 engines, even when the flying boat was in the air. Only one BV-238 was completed. It was destroyed by Allied fighters just before the end of the war. The final example of Luftwaffe gigantism came in the form of the Junkers 390, a stretch 290 with a very capacious 110 feet long fuselage. Propelling this enormous aircraft would require 2 more engines than the Ju-290 and a much greater wing, over 160 feet in span. The extra wing length actually required an additional set of wheels on each side to support the craft as it landed. Only 2 Junkers 390s were ever built, but even these required enormous resources both in labor and material. After the war, only one of the Ju-390s was ever accounted for. This led to speculation as to what happened to the other aircraft, as the type had more range than any other German plane. When they already had a proven workhorse in the Ju-52, why did the Third Reich become so preoccupied with limited numbers of large transport aircraft? One possibility was that Germany had not prepared for a long war. The premise of Blitzkrieg was achieving quick victory by lightning attacks. The English Channel stymied Blitzkrieg against Britain. With the rapid fall of France, crossing the Channel became the Wehrmacht's primary objective. This could partially be achieved by gliders, which led to large transport planes like the Gigant. Often overlooked, there was one other design that evolved in the fatherland during those turbulent years: the Arado 232, sometimes called the millipede. Just after Germany invaded Poland, the Air Ministry issued a request for a replacement for the Ju-52. It must be equipped with a rear entry ramp and would employ 2 of the recently developed BMW 801 radial engines. Arado designers quickly came up with a brilliant design that embraced all the latest thinking in transport aircraft. It had a rear loading ramp, but unlike most other medium-sized transports of the time, it used a tricycle undercarriage. This type of wheel arrangement would not usually work in rough terrain. However, Arado engineers solved the problem by placing a row of small rollers under each side of the fuselage. If necessary, the main gear could be adjusted to kneel the plane down. The 232 would then simply crawl over obstacles on its many rollers, which led to its nickname, the millipede.
At the end of World War II, we were, of course, interested in bringing quite a lot of heavy stuff back from Germany, like wind tunnel gear and even airplanes. And we were looking for cargo planes. We used a German aircraft called the Arado 232, known as the millipede because of the large number of bogie wheels that it had as part of its undercarriage layout. And this was a most effective system of operating on grass airfields, which abounded in Germany in the early stages, and where traction was very difficult to find under adverse weather conditions.
The millipede's level loading ramp made it ideal for all types of cargo. But the Arado 232 had a major problem. It came in the form of this plane, the very successful Focke-Wulf 190, known as the Butcher Bird. The 190 used the same BMW 801 radial engines envisioned for the new Arado transport. After the German failure at the Battle of Britain, there was no doubt that the new FW-90 had priority for the BMW engines. The Arado would have to look elsewhere for suitable power plants, but there were none with the same power as the BMW 801. To solve this problem, a 4-engine millipede was proposed with a larger wing. This change led to delays. The end result was that possibly the best military transport of the Second World War was limited to a production run of less than 20 examples, leaving Auntie to soldier on alone. Eventually, almost 5,000 Ju-52s were made. Many continued to fly around the world for a number of years after the war, including some with the RAF. But Auntie was not their only Luftwaffe transport. 2 Arado 232 millipedes were also flown by the Royal Air Force.
Over 30 years ago, the C-130 transformed military airlift operations. During the Vietnam War, its service was crucial, fulfilling both resupply and transport roles. The C-130 saved thousands of soldiers on the ground. Although other models have been designed, none have surpassed this legend in military aviation. The C-130 Hercules remains one of the most extraordinary aircraft worldwide. Still in production after 35 years, Lockheed's Marietta, Georgia plant recently completed the 1900th C-130. Though it appears similar, every component has been updated. The Hercules that rolled off the line in the 1950s have become today's advanced models. From the start, Lockheed's leadership believed in the C-130. At the time, company head Robert Gross forecasted that the Hercules would meet current needs and continue to fly far into the future. Seeking to modernize their outdated and bulkier transports, the Air Force and Army were set to embrace the jet era. In essence, what they needed and got was a hybrid of truck, jeep, and aircraft. Mr. Bob Roach, Lockheed's vice president of the Hercules program, led the initiative.
They came up with a requirement for a tactical transport that had some very unique demands, such as a drive-on, drive-off capability on the airplane, which required the whole aft end of an airplane to open up, and numerous other unique requirements. And many people who saw the design, including the renowned Kelly Johnson, commented that it was the ugliest airplane he had ever seen.
The C-130A took its first flight on April 7, 1955, piloted by Mr. Leo Sullivan.
Well, it's been a long time since the first flight, but I got to tell you that from the day we first flew the airplane, it was probably the finest transport anyone could have. Today, in the C-130, we produce 3 aircraft a month. In days past, we produced as high as 18 aircraft per month.
Lockheed engineers are still actively creating new versions to ensure production extends into the 21st century. Over time, the Hercules has expanded in size, range, and capabilities. The B model introduced numerous upgrades, including more robust engines. 4 Allison T56A47 engines powered this model, with the older 3-bladed propellers swapped for 4-bladed ones. The maximum range was boosted to 4,000 miles. In an effort to reduce takeoff distance, Lockheed added boundary layer control, incorporating 2 jet engines alongside the 4 turboprops on the Hercules. The jets directed air over the control surfaces, enhancing lift and enabling the aircraft to lift off after a ground roll of roughly 400 feet. The C-130E model produced for the Military Aircraft Command boosted the aircraft's cargo capacity to 155,000 pounds. Range was the key improvement in the C-130E, as it could cross the Atlantic non-stop. On short, rough airstrips, the Hercules often uses jet-assisted takeoff, or JATO, reducing takeoff distance from a 1,500-foot minimum to about 800 feet. The latest Hercules model, the C-130H, incorporates many upgrades, making it thoroughly modern. When the military needed an aircraft to deploy troops and supplies, the C-130 was available. Lockheed's Hercules introduced prop jet power to transport aircraft. Even the Navy, setting aside its natural rivalry with the Air Force, adopted the C-130. The Marines initiated this by seeking an assault transport that could also serve as a tanker. One of the Hercules' most striking feats was a carrier landing. The pilot earned a Distinguished Flying Cross by firmly landing the plane on deck. Despite its success, the Navy ultimately decided that carrier landings were too risky for the Hercules. Today, the Navy employs the Hercules for refueling, paradrop, and resupply operations. The U.S. Coast Guard regularly flies patrols with its H-130s, tracking and marking large Atlantic icebergs that threaten northern shipping routes. A growing responsibility for the HC-130 involves spotting and monitoring oil slicks. Once detected, floating barriers can be deployed to help contain the oil. With global demand for offshore resources, coastal surveillance has gained importance. Many countries have extended their territorial waters to 200 nautical miles. Coast surveillance teams worldwide consider the Hercules an ideal aircraft for maritime patrol. Currently, over 60 countries are using more than 40 different commercial and military Hercules versions. In any color or configuration, the Hercules has always shown up in times of need. It has delivered food to the hungry, provided relief to disaster victims, and brought hope to isolated areas worldwide. It's no wonder this flying truck is often called the Samaritan of the skies.
The C-130 is a crew airplane, and it really is a crew airplane in all the best sense of the word. Everybody is working together. Of course, at different times, people have different workloads, but the people flying the airplane flew it as a crew, and many times on the ground you stayed as a crew too.
We call it pig and hog, and other little terms you probably heard today. Especially when we're trying to make it do something like land, talking it down. It's the same thing when you're fishing. You got to talk to the fish. You won't catch it. It's just like the airplane. It's the same thing. Down there, you got to talk it down. It's part of it.
Perhaps the C-130's most heroic chapter was in Vietnam. The aircraft's full capabilities were tested under these intense conditions. The men flying the C-130s were as integral to the war as any frontline soldier. The Hercules story in Southeast Asia is also theirs.
First day of the mission, quite an interesting factor. One day you're doing one thing, actually one part of the day you're doing one thing, the next day you're doing something different. Had a lot of diversions, combat essential missions, hauling ammunition, emergency airvacs, taking people out, mass casualties, and so on. Keeps you on your toes.
I had a real good diversion last time. I was flying a mission, almost through with it, and they diverted me in for emergency blood resupply into the province up north. And it was real interesting. I mean, we weren't expecting it. We thought we were through for the day. Went in there and hit the bust to ceiling. It was right down in mountains and land on a short field. It was real slippery. Scared me good. Nervous me.
Touchdown markers, 200 and 500 feet down the runway with red color.
Roger, copy, 607.
We're in the Airlift Control Center of the 834th Air Division in Saigon, where the daily flight operations of the airlift in Vietnam is monitored, scheduled, and controlled. The boards that you see in the command center are used to display all the mission information for the some 800 to 1,000 sorties that are flown each day by C-7s, C-123s, and C-130s of the 834th Air Division. The 130 will operate in 2,500 feet, so it does have the capability to go into the forward areas, into the unimproved strips, and where the activity levels are high, the C-130 has proven to be the real workhorse of the fleet.
Came under a rocket attack while we were there, so we got a delay out of there. Took off, I think, at about 7:45. Went up to Quang Tree. We had a combat essential load into Quang Tree, some tank tracks for some tanks going west to Quezon. And we landed at Quang Tree at about 9:30 this morning. When we landed there, we had some problems with our airplane with the nose gear and some engine problems. We had to stay there for about 4 hours and work on the airplane. At about 1 o'clock, our command post sent another airplane in to pick us up. That picked us up and took us down to Chulai, where we had some rockets to pick up to take back into Quezon. That crew flew into Quezon. We landed there at about 4:30 tonight. It took off again about 5 o'clock, came down to Da Nang for fuel, and returned to Tan Son Nhut. That for us is just about 18 hours. It's 29 now. It's late.
I am a flight nurse with the 903rd Air Medical Evacuation Squadron. We have approximately 20 litters and 53 ambulatory patients. They're the best pilots in the world. They'll land on a dirt strip or they'll land on a piece of steel stuck in the middle of some godforsaken place and do a tremendous job. I think the most difficult landing I've ever been on is at Antoy, which is the western part of an island off the western part of Vietnam, Phu Quoc Island. And it has a minimum runway, no lighting. And we went in there one night, it was just pitch black, raining like cats and dogs, and they had sludge pods and jeeps lighting the runway. And those fellas stuck it down there, just beautiful.
Well, you hear pros and cons, from all the troops around. You hear saying we're doing everything over here, and the Vietnamese are not holding up their end. It's their war. They should be fighting more of it. And you get a mission like we had today, and you go up there and you pick up these troops that saw some that had their legs blown up, some of them burning half to death. And I tell you don't get that walking around out on the street. You get kind of mixed feelings, I think. Of course, you're happy to get them out of there because they're hurt. You want to get them back where they can get some treatment, some good treatment. And it's also kind of depressing. You can't get away from that. Of course, that's part of the war. People are going to get hurt. They were fighting their war. There's no doubt about it.
The first KIA I ever hauled. I don't remember the exact place I picked it up, but I knew before we landed that that's what we were picking up. I didn't know how many, and as it happened, we were empty. We had no other cargo on board. We came in, and we brought an ambulance out. It was an unmarked ambulance, and of course I knew they were GI KIAs, and it really makes you stop and think about like Alan has said before, that it may be somebody you know, or it could be you at one time or another. And it's really a bad scene as far as, especially if you've got an empty cargo compartment. It's just you and them, and it seems awful crowded at times.
The C-130 lift was a lifeline to Quezon. They said it was a victory through air power, but for us crunks on the ground, it was really a victory for the 130 capability to deliver here. We had TAC here in support. And these ridge lines in here, we had fighter jocks supporting. I guess B-52 strikes were running right up to the perimeter. But there were days when there was no TAC, close air support, and the 130s continued air land. They'd land up in this area and they'd take fire from the hills surrounding it coming in and be under fire almost constantly. And then when they landed, the NVA and the hills would start flipping a few in on them. We got the name of calling them mortar bait all the time. Their ground times then used to extend sometimes up to about 1 minute. You'd have 60 GIs run on to get out. Sometimes we keep a little longer for medevac. Then they decided the method of delivery they'd use was a container delivery system. Just off this horizon here, we set up a drop zone of about 300 by 300 yards. Very tight, small drop zone. They used a CDS drop. About 600 feet successfully put in about 150 to 200 tons a day. We had some equipment we couldn't deliver in containers. These 1-ton containers, heavy bunker and barrier material, some of which you see around Quezon today. We asked the Air Force what they could do. Started with a LAPE, low altitude parachute extraction. They successfully delivered for a number of days just tons and tons of barrier material and supplies. They were continually taking mortar fire. So we went again into another system called the ground proximity extraction system, which is an arrested barrier and a hook. Our requirements for beans and bullets were well over 200 to 300 tons a day. We got a hell of a lot of inward chopping, but the heavy tonnage requirement was moved by old 130s attack. It's been my experience with working with the airlifters during the last stint here that they supported us in the Delta, back into the Ashore Valley with the first team at Al Louis. They've lost airplanes every trip, but I'll say this much for them. You call them, tell them where it has to be, and they'll put it in.
This job for airlift all the way. I tell you, man, those damn F4 jobs, those 100 jobs, those buff jobs, they're going to be gone. We're still going to be over here hauling trash. Who's important? Tell me. Who's important?
Hercules also took on combat roles. When South Vietnam moved into Laos, the C-130 dropped 15,000-pound bombs to clear landing zones for helicopters. At night, AC-130 gunships equipped with multiple guns and cannons located and destroyed North Vietnamese targets.
Yep. 3 low. There's a hit. It's on lower. Lower. Oh, wow. Go. Nice hit you. Oh, wait up on it. Okay, you got any more? That's a float? You betcha. Negative. Track hit. Alright, tank 1 of target 4.
Thanks.
He's moving. Hit him right on.
Continuing this mission today, Hercules remains armed and prepared. This C-130A is the first production model delivered to the U.S. Air Force, tall number 533129. It holds more firepower than any fighter or bomber dedicated to close air support. This Hercules, known as Spectre, is part of the 919th, the only Air Force Reserve Special Forces group based at Duke Field, Florida. It operates with a 14-person crew, including 5 gunners who manage its weapons. These include 2 7.6mm miniguns, 40mm Bofors cannons, and 20mm Vulcans. When all 6 guns are in action, they can unleash over 17,000 rounds per minute. Spectre is a C-130 designed to operate effectively in the dark. Using television, electronic sensors, and infrared systems, it detects and destroys enemy targets by night. The operations booth is where everything converges. Here, systems operators and fire control officers coordinate with the electronic warfare officer. His role is to locate and counter enemy radar threats. Working with the illuminator operator, he helps protect Spectre from enemy ground fire. He can launch infrared flares to divert enemy heat-seeking missiles.
Yeah, I show hot spots. Over to the left, 47 degrees. Too low, too far, about. Well, PD is going to the Iowa Department. Got a copy of the 5 vehicles. PD is going to the lead vehicle. Consider on. Happy PD 5X. PD 5X. That's all. That's the shot.
The type of warfare in Southeast Asia required heavy use of close air support, with aircraft called in to support ground forces. The Hercules served as an airborne battlefield command post, or ABCCC. The C-130 directed joint air and ground missions, managed direct air support and airborne communications during special strikes, and acted as a command center for air rescue operations. The ABCCC included a large boxcar-sized array of communication and observation equipment. This setup was installed in the C-130 for airborne missions, or could be deployed in a forward area for ground operations. Today, the Hercules still serves as a platform for the ABCCC. The C-130 fulfilled many roles. The RC-130 variant housed a massive camera lens in its belly, with additional cameras and specialized avionics in the cargo area. The RC-130 mapped landscapes and updated maps for numerous countries. Remote piloted vehicles, or drones, were launched from the DC-130 version of the Hercules. Drones have been in use for quite some time, and during the Vietnam War, they became a viable alternative to manned flights. Drones completed over 3,000 missions in Southeast Asia, with 200 lost in combat. Losses that would have otherwise been manned aircraft. Today, drones primarily serve two functions: photo reconnaissance and electronic warfare support. On a photo mission, the DC-130 launches a drone that descends to 500 feet to photograph targets. In electronic warfare, the drone enters high-threat zones to jam enemy radar, either by dispersing chaff or deploying jamming devices. A remote control officer on the DC-130 monitors the drone's activity. When it returns, CH-3 helicopters retrieve it mid-air. Crews often joke that when trying to catch the 3,000-pound bird, it's hard to tell who's catching whom. But with the HC-130 coordinating, the rescue helicopter stays in firm control. This Hercules model manages search and recovery efforts, relaying distress signals to helicopters for land and sea rescues. The JC-130 Hercules even assisted in retrieving astronauts returning from space. Equipped with hooks and winch lines, it captured instruments descending by parachute from orbit. As a capsule descended, the JC-130 would snatch it in mid-air. Other Hercules models pioneered airborne winch systems, lifting loads into the plane, leading to new rescue techniques. The JC Hercules laid the groundwork for the MC-130 Combat Talon. Special Operations Forces use the Talon equipped with the Fulton Recovery System for live pickups. The Talon can recover downed pilots, rescue agents, or retrieve classified materials from enemy zones. Thanks to terrain-following radar and all-weather capability, the MC-130 and its skilled crew can reach areas inaccessible to conventional aircraft. With the Fulton system, gear is paradropped to the person on the ground for pickup. It takes around 20 minutes to don the special recovery suit and get ready for the pickup. During this time, the Combat Talon crew completes final checks of the Fulton system. The person on the ground releases a helium-filled balloon to position the pickup line and signal that they are ready. And they're ready for the ride of their life. The unusual Hercules is Britain's Sea Mark II weather aircraft. Behind its long, candy-striped nose is an array of advanced weather equipment. While the U.S. Air Force WC-130 may not appear as distinctive, its mission is just as crucial. While the U.S. Air Force WC-130 may not appear as distinctive, its mission is just as crucial. The WC-130 is known as the Hurricane Hunter.
Where most pilots try to avoid severe weather, our pilots and our air crews go looking for the worst weather known to mankind.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Dennis Wood, commander of the 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron, or as we're better known, the Hurricane Hunters. We are one of only 2 such units in the active duty Air Force and 1 in the Air Force Reserves. Our primary mission is to fly into the eye of hurricanes in order to gather weather data for the National Hurricane Center, which they use in forecasting of movement, strength, and development of tropical storms. The weather officers and drop zone systems operators are part of their weather service, while the remainder of the personnel are assigned to the 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron.
Let's go fly storm.
You fly into the weather environment to look at it, to study it, whereas in a normal assignment, you usually stay on the ground to do that.
A lot of times we'll go out and fly the same hurricane 3, 4, 5 days in a row. A lot of those times you end up flying about 12 hours. You come back and land and you have 12 hours crew rest and you're out again, the same storm the next day.
In this particular mission, a navigator is really important because a computer can be used from point to point, but we don't fly point to point in a storm. We're trying to draw a line to the center of the storm, and it isn't always straight. Every storm's different. Nothing can be decided ahead of time.
Once you go to the wall, that's probably the busiest time for us. Not too much thought about the hurricane goes on.
If it's real bumpy, you just try and work the best you can. We release the sound into the atmosphere, and it free falls with a parachute, sends back pressure, temperature, and humidity. From that, we take the data, analyze it, and then send it back to the Hurricane Center.
Everything's done in a real safe manner. In over 100,000 flying hours, we've never had a major aircraft accident.
The experience that I've had that I really think is worth mentioning is the first storm, because it's beautiful to look at. It just struck me that I was very fortunate to be able to see a hurricane from that direction. Not many people have.
I think that we're doing a valuable service for the people of the United States, but the mission we do will save some lives and help people prepare. It gives us a great satisfaction to be doing that type of humanitarian mission.
Now, here we are. How about that? Willie Todd, 320, on deck after DCA for right turn on.
The roar of jet engines and the thud of the world's largest skis helped bring Antarctica closer to the world when the Hercules made its historic landing at the South Pole. It was the first aircraft of its size to land there, revolutionizing Antarctic operations. Antarctica, the Great White Continent, spans over 5 million square miles at the Earth's southern tip. For centuries, its freezing temperatures and long polar nights kept the South Pole in glacial isolation. Bridging the vast cold and distance has been the dream of every polar explorer. In 1928, Richard E. Byrd led the first major American expedition into Antarctica. Among the expedition's equipment was Byrd's aircraft, a Ford trimotor called the Floyd Bennett, selected for its size, durability, and power. The team struggled with the plane, trying to protect it from the harsh elements. From the start, the land seemed to resist any attempts to prepare for its aerial exploration. Finally, in November 1928, the Floyd Bennett was ready for its historic flight. Months of effort culminated in the ultimate test of the aircraft's capabilities in the Antarctic. Byrd planned to fly the Floyd Bennett directly over the South Pole and photograph the journey. On November 29th, Byrd and the Floyd Bennett took off from the base camp at Little America. Those left behind tracked his progress via radio, offering cheers and wishes of good luck as he departed. Having come so far, Byrd succeeded in the skies. Freezing temperatures and icy winds couldn't deter Byrd and his plane from reaching their goal, the South Pole, 90 degrees south. Byrd dropped the U.S. flag as he flew over the exact spot, making a historic moment. His dream had come true, and his flight was a success. It marked the start of a new era for aviation in Antarctica, opening the door for more extensive exploration of the vast, inhospitable continent. In the 1930s, Byrd made other expeditions to Antarctica, though not always with the same success. Several planes were damaged or destroyed by the harsh winds and cold. In later years, skis and prop jet engines would help fulfill the dream of polar flight, opening more areas for exploration. The Hercules arrived fully equipped for the job, landing on the world's largest skis, 20 feet long and weighing 1 ton each. The LC-130 can land on a remote ice shelf with the same ease as on a dry runway. From the outset, LC-130s supported the Navy's Operation Deep Freeze, along with other scientific missions at the South Pole. They revolutionized the exploration of the Great White Continent, taking scientists to previously inaccessible locations. The Hercules became a vital lifeline, delivering food, fuel, and supplies to these remote outposts. At the other end of the world, the L-100 commercial Hercules transported 100 million pounds of supplies, food, and equipment to Alaska's oil fields. Hercules also played a crucial role in transporting construction materials for the Alaska oil pipeline. The global Hercules fleet has accumulated nearly 19 million flight hours, maintaining a strong record of safety and reliability. The C-130 Hercules, the true workhorse of the jet age. A one-airplane Air Force.
One of the largest and mightiest transports in the world, a concentration of unusual technical solutions, and the biggest American military aircraft that has been in service for 50 years, the C-5 Galaxy. In the 1960s, the US military had an active presence in many locations around the world, and a rather diverse fleet of aircraft was responsible for operational logistics between those locations. The leader was the Douglas C-130 Cargo Master, a large turboprop transport capable of lifting as much as 50 tons of cargo and taking it to the right place. The plane at its time was a champion, but not without problems. It absorbed a lot of innovations, but many of the ideas of aviators were not realized in it. The turboprop engine was reliable, but limited the flight speed to 280 knots, approximately 520 kilometers per hour. Quite enough for small transports, the C-130 is proof of this, but for a long-range strategic aircraft, not so much. The military, having gained experience with various aircraft, came to the conclusion that it was time to abandon half measures and acquire jet transports. The C-135 Stratolifter appeared in the flock. Good aircraft, but limited in capabilities. Another half measure. A complete solution in 1963 was the Lockheed C-141 Starlifter. Its carrying capacity was less than that of the Cargo Master, but the speed was already decent, and its reliability and flexibility were much better. The problem was in the insufficient volume of the cargo compartment. The cost for speed was a narrow fuselage. But this satisfied the military. The C-141 didn't have to be a giant, and it successfully served in its niche for many decades. But the C-133 did not make it as a giant at all. Its advantage, the size and carrying capacity, quickly became insufficient. The equipment was getting larger and heavier. This was felt even stronger after the appearance of information about the Soviet An-22, also a turboprop but much larger. It became obvious that in order to effectively fulfill all strategic requirements, a faster, larger, and more spacious aircraft was needed. Much larger and much more spacious. The apogee of the wondering was the CX-X program, deployed back in the early 1960s, which was supposed to determine the image of a machine capable of quickly transferring to anywhere in the world practically any type of cargo. Soldiers, weapons, equipment, planes, helicopters, armored vehicles, anything. Without any reservations in the style of, this will fly and everything else takes the boat. What was this plane supposed to be like? So you understand, this is the C-141 Starlifter, a new and quite advanced aircraft. The future plane was supposed to be something like this. The guys weren't being modest, a huge cargo compartment which could accommodate more than 80 tons of cargo. At the beginning. As the concept developed, ambition and performance rapidly grew, and soon the desired payload was over 100 tons. In addition to the monstrous size of the plane, there was another, no less serious problem: the engines. The required flight speed is more than 430 knots, which means it must be a jet. Except, taking into account the size and weight, it would need 6 to 8 engines of that time under the wing, like the B-52. Terrible for a large transport. The answer to all questions was simple and colorful. There must be 4 motors. Getting them is your concern. The finale of all this research work in 1964 was the initiation of the Heavy Logistics System, or CX-HLS program. Boeing, Douglas, General Dynamics, Lockheed, and Martin Marietta, while they were still apart, took part in a tender for the creation of a new aircraft. A separate battle was fought for the engine for the future aircraft, in which Curtiss Wright, Pratt & Whitney, and General Electric took part. The race was tough, and several participants dropped out of it pretty quickly. The aviators presented several rather similar solutions: high swept wings, cargo doors both in front and in the back, as well as cockpits at the top. There were also many differences, for example in the layouts of the upper decks, tail surfaces, and other nuances. During this time, Pratt & Whitney and General Electric were working on the engines, and their task was just as, if not more, difficult. But they found more or less adequate solutions, which crystallized in 2 fiery hots: General Electric TF-39 and Pratt & Whitney JTF-14. Thrust was achieved by using a variety of advanced solutions, both for individual elements and very large-scale ones, revolutionary for entire aviation. We will talk about them a little later. The Pentagon announced the winners of the tender in 1965. The future heavy transport would be made by the guys from Lockheed, and General Electric would supply the engine for it. This is how the Lockheed C-5 Galaxy was born. It's time to look at the outcome of this whole race. Length 75.3 meters, wingspan 67.9 meters, height 19.8 meters. Climbing on top of the T-tail, you find yourself on the roof of a 6-story building. Inheriting the overall look of the Starlifter, the C-5 makes it clear why it was named Galaxy. The huge fuselage is not round in cross-section, as it was done before, but resembles a pear with a wide expansion at the bottom and a narrow part above. The reason for this is the unusual layout and filling. The main element of a military transport aircraft is the cargo compartment. The dimensions were declared by the customer, who wanted to place almost the entire range of weapons here and be able to drop it on a parachute in flight. 5.8 meters wide, 4.1 meters high, and a whopping 37 meters long. It is more than the distance the Wright brothers' plane traveled on its first flight. Naturally, the deck floor is reinforced. There are fastenings for fixing cargo and equipment, as well as retractable roller lines for placing containers. You can load 6 Apache helicopters, or 5 Bradley fighting vehicles, or 2 Abrams tanks here. The cabin, of course, is pressurized, so soldiers can be accommodated here, up to 270 people, not counting those on the upper deck. The problem of the huge cargo compartment was access to it. One tail door is not enough, so it was decided to add another way in front. A set of hydraulic drives lifts the nose section up, and a ramp lowers below. The way through the tail is less exotic. A large flap rises at the top, a ramp lowers at the bottom, and a large double door opens in between. Plus, a vertical hermetic door inside rises to the ceiling. As a result, when all the doors are open, the cargo compartment of the C-5 turns into a huge 2-way hangar, making the loading and unloading procedures easier. Since the dimensions of the cargo compartment were fixed by the customer, and they didn't want to make the plane itself too gigantic, all the auxiliary elements were moved up, so the C-5 got a second deck stretched over the entire fuselage, like a spine. Meanwhile, the center wing box divided this deck into two parts. In the front is the cockpit, part of the aircraft equipment, as well as crew restrooms. In the back, behind the wing, there is a kind of passenger cabin, where in seats in the 3+3 layout, up to 80 people can be accommodated like in a conventional airliner, except without windows. There are kitchens in both parts. Behind the passenger cabin is an extruding section with a lot of empty space called the hayloft. Here are the cargo hatch doors, service corridors, and the load-bearing structure holding the T-tail, a big thing that puts out decent loads, so there are a lot of elements. Of course, the plane is not limited to large gates. The crew will not open them for any little thing. Small doors for people are on both decks, in front and in the back on the port side, and in the back on starboard. The cockpit was made quite spacious. Here, 4 people work, 2 pilots, a flight engineer, and a navigator, in the beginning. With modifications, the navigator was no longer needed. The number of the entire crew varied quite a lot, because there are also aircraft commander, cargo operators, plus sometimes another shift. The front upper deck is designed for 15 people. The aircraft received extremely advanced flight instruments, equipped with state-of-the-art automation, navigation, and a bunch of other features, including, for example, a continuous monitoring MADAR system, with 600 sensors scattered throughout the aircraft. All critical elements are duplicated. The C-5 is equipped with 4 hydraulic systems working in parallel. The cockpit glazing is quite minimalistic. Lockheed used a scheme almost the same as that of their own C-141. The designers of the C-5 landing gear were faced with the task of making a structure capable of holding a 380-ton aircraft, not only on a concrete runway but also on grass runways. The result of their work was large, powerful, and complex. The main landing gear is equipped with 4 big legs, with bogies on which 6 wheels are installed in pairs. The pair of rear legs can rotate, which reduces the turning radius of the aircraft in a limited space of the airfield. And all these mechanics have to be closely packed inside the aircraft in flight, so when retracted, the bogies first turn 90 degrees and then go into their niches like into pockets, closed by sliding doors of large fairings. The steering nose landing gear is also not without nuance, with a single leg and a bogie with 4 wheels in a row. Meanwhile, the nose of the aircraft is narrowed, so the niche of the leg forms a small hump, and the doors do not swing open as usual, but move to the sides. In addition, the landing gear has a kneeling function. The main gear legs contract, lowering the fuselage. The front leg is partially retracted, and the plane, in a way, lies down on its belly. In this position, loading and unloading operations are greatly simplified. The landing gear does its job. The C-5 works quite efficiently in, let's say, a wide range of conditions. It took 28 large wheels for all this, but it seems to work. It even managed to fly to Antarctica. One of the most difficult tasks, which, as we will see later, Lockheed solved not immediately, was the wing. The C-5 combines enormous size, equally enormous mass, and high flight speed, and aviators had to create a design that could withstand an incredible operational load. The Galaxy's wing has a span of 67.9 meters and an area of about 580 square meters, which is 2 times the wing area of the Boeing 707. In this parameter, it was second only to the Hughes' Hercules. To accomplish this task, it was necessary to apply all available technologies and solutions. The wing mechanization is highly developed. Each console has a slat extended almost to the tips. On the trailing edge, there is a group of 12 separate retractable flaps, separated by powerful drive pylons. And on top, there are also 12 spoilers, plus of course large ailerons. It looks complicated, but it was necessary for more precise control, reducing loads, and improving takeoff and landing performance. If you think that a heavy, wide-body transport the size of a building is a serious challenge, you haven't seen the engines yet. In the early 1960s, aviation jet engines were already quite decent and were actively used, with diameters up to 1.5 meters and temperatures in front of the turbine reaching as much as 900 degrees Celsius. The bypass scheme already existed, allowing a slight increase in thrust, saving fuel. The bypass ratio was about 1.4 to 1. Any engine builder of that time would say that this is quite decent. Improve the performance by 15% and there's a new generation for you. But we know what the new aircraft required, and the engine builders, seeing these requirements, decided to innovate, putting it politely. But in fact, they totally went Breaking Bad. Let's look at the General Electric TF-39. The main step towards a breakthrough in thrust was to increase the volume of air passing through the bypass duct, which became physically much larger. The challenge here was to create a much larger fan that would be capable of pulling and holding serious loads. The pressure increased even more due to the installation of the second fan. A slightly smaller one was placed in front of the main one. A bonus was the flaps along the radius of the air intake, feeding the engine at low speeds. The task was completed. The bypass ratio reached 8 to 1. 8. Of course, this was not enough, and almost everything was a breakthrough. The overall pressure ratio jumped from 15 for conventional engines to 25 here. Operating temperature 900 degrees Celsius, you say? Now you get 1370 degrees. This may not be very impressive in our time, but in the 1960s it was simply incredible. General Electric put all the technologies they could into the engine. The latest materials and alloys, cooled blades, sophisticated controls, everything. Thrust? The fiery heart of the C141, the TF-33 engine, delivered just over 90 kilonewtons. The TF-39 on the C5 was capable of 193 kilonewtons, more than twice as much. Such performance looked especially funny when the engines were passing flight tests under the wing of a flying lab based on the B-52 bomber. The Stratofortresses were mostly powered by the J-57 engines, with a thrust of 46.71 kilonewtons. And when the big guy was put in cruise mode, the aircraft could barely compensate for the thrust imbalance. In fact, it turned out that instead of 8 old engines, only 2 new ones could be installed on a plane, and the bomber would fly just fine. To the big C5, this power plant gave exactly the performance that was needed. The aircraft had a cruising speed of around 450 knots, 850 kilometers per hour, and a service ceiling of around 10-11 kilometers. Average for a large jet, but certainly much better than turboprops. Considering that the landing distance of the aircraft had to be made as short as possible, the engines received a powerful cascade-type thrust reverser mechanism in the 1960s. On the ground, of course, no one wants to disturb these monsters. To provide energy at the airfield, an auxiliary power unit is used. 2 APU units are installed in fairings below, just behind the niches of the main landing gear. The C5 is a strategic transport aircraft, and whatever its carrying capacity, it would have little use without range, which means it had to be able to fly 10 to 11,000 kilometers, or 5,500 miles across the oceans. With large loads, of course less, but not by much. With all the specific efficiency of the power plant, the appetites of the engines were huge, and there had to be a lot of fuel. 12 tanks with a total capacity of 193,600 liters were placed inside the wing, more than 150 tons. A fully equipped and fueled Boeing 757 is lighter. Moreover, the tanks are integral. There are no separate containers in them. The fuel goes straight into the internal volumes of the wing. In flight, these volumes, as fuel is consumed, are filled with nitrogen stored here. To meet strategic range requirements, the C5 also received an aerial refueling system. It was very useful both for increasing the flight range and for more tricky maneuvers. For example, taking off with a larger load and less fuel and adding it up in flight. Did you think only the blackbirds indulged in such things? The C5A prototype was presented in early 1968 at the airfield of the Marietta Aircraft Factory in Georgia. A vivid impression when a building was rolled out of the building. Already in the summer, the plane made its maiden flight, and Lockheed finally entered the testing phase of their revolutionary brainchild.
120. Airborne. Airborne it is.
The work was carried out quite vigorously, and the first serial C-5A Galaxy began to be transferred to the military at the end of 1969. As soon as the C-5s entered service, they were immediately thrown into action. The Vietnam War was in full swing. The aircraft transported everything to Vietnam, from bullets to tanks. Despite the many difficulties in operation, the superiority over the old machines was obvious. The history of the C-133 practically ended. In 1971, they were all withdrawn from service. Alas, Vietnam did not go without losses for the C-5. During the evacuation of children from Saigon, an explosive decompression occurred on board, causing a partial loss of control. The crew turned the plane around and tried to make an emergency landing, but the plane did not reach the airbase and crashed into a field. Of the 314 people on board, 138 did not survive the fall. It was one of the worst disasters in the history of American military transport aviation. In the history of the C-5, however, it was not the only one. During the entire period of operation, 6 planes were completely destroyed, of which 4 in the 1970s, mostly without human losses. Mostly. Another large-scale transport story of those years was Operation Nickelgrass, when the group of C-5 and C-141 supplied Israel with weapons during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. At the height of the fighting, the transports carried into the country more than 22,000 tons of weapons, armored vehicles, helicopters, and planes. Given the gravity of the situation, who knows? Perhaps Israel owes its existence to this whale. Such operations, on one scale or another, were carried out by the C-5s quite actively and are still being carried out. After a couple of decades of wandering, the Pentagon nevertheless found a normal military transport. The most fun for engineers began in 1974. Remember the story about the ideas of the Soviet military to launch ballistic missiles from the An-22? Well, the Pentagon also thought about it, but these guys decided to try. The C-5, in flight over the Pacific Ocean, dropped a 39-ton Minuteman ICBM from its cargo compartment, without a warhead of course. In freefall, the missile started its engine, rose several kilometers, and then fell into the sea, completing the test. American aviators and rocket scientists came to the same conclusion as their Soviet counterparts, and did not continue the work. Why did they need to launch a missile for this? Why not? Alas, the history of the big plane was not without big problems. The aircraft turned out to be incredibly complex. It was difficult to work with. There were constant problems with various systems and especially with engines. The C-5, in addition to the name Galaxy, received the nickname FRED, an acronym that stood for Fucking Ridiculous Economic Disaster. The plane was admired by everyone who worked with it, but as they say, from Galaxy to FRED, there is one step. Naturally, Lockheed tried to maintain aircraft production by finding new markets. Quite quickly, the L-500 project was born, a civilian version in cargo and passenger options, capable of carrying as many as 1,000 people. But Fred appeared for a reason, and the airlines knew about this nickname. It was obvious that such a complex aircraft in commercial aviation would be uncompetitive. And with the advent of cargo versions of the Boeing 747, this issue was basically closed. They were also actively pestering NASA with proposals to create special versions for them. In particular, it was about transport platforms for carrying oversized cargo and space shuttle orbiters. It was logical. At least one could look at colleagues from the USSR, who easily carried anything on the backs of their giants. However, it did not work out with the shuttles. NASA chose as carriers the modified Boeing 747. Yes, again. However, the agency did not completely refuse the C-5. In the early 1980s, aviators took 2 basic C-5As and, by clearing the upper deck behind the wing and replacing the tail hatch, increased the volume of the cargo compartment. This was necessary to accommodate large cargo, such as spacecraft, inside the plane. This is how a pair of C-5A SCM, Space Cargo Modified, or simply C-5C planes appeared. It was almost impossible to sell the original military transports, although in the mid-1970s Iran, which became the exclusive customer of the F-14 Tomcat fighters, also wanted to become the exclusive customer of the C-5 transports. Negotiations were held but ceased after the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The world did not see a non-American galaxy. Lockheed put a lot of effort into solving the problems of their brainchild, but when it seemed that the initial issues were resolved, new ones surfaced, which were much more difficult to handle. When it comes to advanced solutions and innovations in any complex technology, the word risk always appears. This word becomes especially dangerous when the manufacturer, for the sake of winning the tender, promises a lot of things and in a short time tries to fulfill those promises. In particular, this affected the huge wing, which they tried to make as light as possible. Composite elements, aluminum honeycomb filler, the latest alloys, as well as design optimization. A minimum of parts with minimum weight. The problem was that some of the latest solutions, due to them being the latest, were not tested that much in practice, and the optimized design left almost no margin of durability. In 1969, while the wing was tested for maximum loads, it broke, which is fine, it was broken on purpose. The problem was that it was supposed to break at 150% of the allowed maximum, but it broke at 128%. Bad sign. The second bad sign appeared during resource tests. It turned out that during active operation, fatigue cracks begin to appear in a number of elements of the wing structure, and they appear quite quickly. Lockheed came up with a plan to make minor changes that could be implemented during the maintenance process, but it turned out that they were practically useless. An especially bad part was that it all became clear when the C-5 was already mass-produced and delivered. That is, the Giants already flying in the Air Force risked falling apart in flight, and in order to avoid tragic news, it was necessary to urgently limit the load, hence the performance of the aircraft. The maximum cargo weight was reduced from the promised 100 to 86 tons, and only when it was really necessary. In practice, the Epic Giants flew half empty. To say that the customer was unhappy is an understatement. Scandals and disputes began, up to the start of an investigation by Congress. Not only was the cost of the program well above the plan, but the resulting aircraft was far from what everyone expected. Lockheed had fallen on hard times. In 1973, after the delivery of a series of 81 aircraft, production was stopped. The financial burden of the company started to become crushing. In addition to expenses for the transport C-5, expenses for the passenger L-1011 TriStar, which had just recently taken off, were also piling up. But the company was too big to fail. The Pentagon was well aware that its bankruptcy could bring even more problems than it already has, so the government smacked Lockheed with one hand and saved it with the other. There were no options. In the late 1970s, it was decided to completely replace the wings of most aircraft with new and seriously redesigned ones, plus modify and boost the engines. Such re-winging lasted until 1986. Touch 77 planes took several years and cost about $1.5 billion, about $7 billion by modern measures. This solved the problems of the wing and restored the initial capabilities, even with a slight overfulfillment. The load capacity increased by about 9 tons. The problem was solved, but everyone had more gray hair now. Production of the C-5 was put on hold back in 1973, and many believed that after the modernization of the existing fleet, the production line would be completely closed. But history is full of surprises. After moving into the White House, the newly elected President Ronald Reagan began in his own way to revive the power of the US military. Apparently it was weak. The C-17 Globemaster III program was still in its very early stages, while the revamped C-5 seemed to be quite decent. In addition, in the Soviet Union, its main counterpart, the heavy transport An-124 Ruslan, or the NATO name Condor, took to the skies. Being close in design, it surpassed the C-5A in a number of specifications. Those who wanted to revive and modernize the Lockheed Giant received another argument in cabinet disputes. it was decided to resume production and order a new batch of upgraded C-5B transports. By the way, at the same time in the same format, the B-1B Lancer bomber received a second wind. The C-5B received improved avionics, an optimized design and updated engines. The changes were not particularly drastic, but the aircraft was much easier to operate and the performance was again slightly increased. The load limit was now at 118 tons. The first plane entered service in 1986, and by 1989 the military received 50 units. They did not have to sit idle, because it was time for the largest mission in the history of the C-5, Desert Storm. After Saddam Hussein's attack on Kuwait, the United States and allies began moving forces to the Middle East. The group of C-5, C-141, C-130 and KC-10 aircraft delivered 534,000 people and 542,000 tons of cargo to the region in a little more than a month. Compared to that, the Berlin airlift feels like home delivery of pizza. The Flock of Giants served in this program until the end of the 1990s, when it was decided to make an upgrade. The AMP, Avionics Modernization Program, was exactly that. The C-5 fleet received new glass cockpits with digital interfaces, new navigation, autopilots, and other systems. This work was completed in 2002. In 2006, the remaining C-141 Starlifters went into retirement, replaced by the new C-17 Globemaster III. At the same time, it was decided to optimize the entire fleet of transport aircraft, and another RERP, Reliability Enhancement and Re-engineering Program, was launched, the task of which was to increase the reliability and efficiency of aircraft primarily through applying the new engines. The C-5 received General Electric F-138 GE100, which were in fact the military versions of the GE CF6 engines, which at one time were created as a civilian version of the TF-39. The Circle of Life. The new engine was not as exotic as its progenitor, but it was much more modern, efficient and reliable. In addition, unlike the unique base engines, the CF6, similar in components, was installed on many wide-body aircraft, making it cheaper both in production and in maintenance. The F-138s were much more powerful than the older TF-39s, putting out as much as 230 kilonewtons of thrust. This made it possible to increase the payload mass to 127 tons. Finally, a little more than that of the basic AN-124. No need to be embarrassed anymore. Equally important was the improvement of fuel efficiency, which increased the range. The new aircraft could fly 8,900 kilometers with a load of 54 tons, and empty with full tanks as much as 13,000 kilometers, nearly 7,000 miles, a quarter more than before. The takeoff and landing distances have also been seriously reduced. Now only 1,650 meters long runway is enough for work, and this is a Colossus weighing 381 tons. Thus was born the C-5M Super Galaxy version that is relevant to our time. In total, 49 version B aircraft, 2 version C and 1 version A aircraft were driven through these programs. They were already a little old and were gradually being decommissioned. By 2017, there were no C-5A left in the fleet. Deliveries of the upgraded aircraft were completed in 2018. The C-5M versions, according to various estimates, should fly for another 30 to 40 years, and will be almost as long-lived as the grandfather B-52. In total, through 2 series of production, 131 aircraft were assembled, 81 C-5A and 50 C-5B. Now in service in the C-5M version, there are about 50 gray whales. The C-5 Galaxy became a milestone in American military history and had a major impact on the world of heavy transport aircraft. But its impact on the aviation industry, although not direct, is much larger, because it is the CX-HLS program that is in a sense the beginning of such a thing as a wide-body airliner. How? The aviation community was very interested in the birth of the giant aircraft. Yes, there were already large machines with wide fuselages, but it was in the process of creating a huge jet transport that the airlines watching it were convinced a plane could be much larger than what they had at that time. And what range can such an aircraft provide? What comfort and what capacity? Not to mention that this is a clear solution to the problem of overcrowded airports. Ah, how tempting. Demand creates supply. When Boeing lost the CX-HLS tender, they were immediately approached by representatives, primarily of Pan American, with the question, is it possible to create a similar large and long-range aircraft, but a civilian one? The answer to this question was the Boeing 747, the world's first wide-body airliner, which turned the entire transportation industry on its head. A queen with cult status, 50 years of serial production, and over 1,500 aircraft delivered to dozens of airlines, against 131 aircraft supplied by Lockheed to the military. This is what you can do with the ability to overturn even a defeat. And this is just the 747. The rest followed. DC-10 and L-1011 in the USA, in Europe the A300 was born, the first Airbus, and in the USSR the Il-86, and all within literally 5 to 6 years. It is quite difficult to imagine the modern air transportation industry without wide-body airliners, and all the current big guys, one way or another, came from the desire to stuff a couple of tanks into a plane. And the second innovation that has affected the industry practically on a total scale is engines. When the C-5 was created, it required a power plant that combined huge power and decent economy. To meet this requirement, engine builders made a real breakthrough by creating the world's first large turbofan engines. The TF-39 won the tender and took to the wing, but General Electric could not deny themselves the pleasure of creating its civilian modification. And so, the GE CF-6 was born. The losers of the tender, Pratt & Whitney, just like Boeing, did not lose heart, and putting away the military JT-F-14, made a civilian version on its basis. This is how the JT-9D engine appeared. This company was a huge breakthrough in civil engine building, and the key to wide-body aviation. Without them, such large aircraft simply wouldn't be able to fly. It was they who became the basis of the fiery hearts of most early wide-body planes, and it is their concept and solutions that are the basis of civilian jet engines to this day. The history of Galaxy began half a century ago, and will continue for several more decades. The epic nature of this giant is hard to overestimate, as is its impact on the aviation industry. Let's wish good luck to the gray whale, and hope that it will not have to fly to hot spots with tanks in its belly. At least not too often. And this is where our story ends. Like and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the continuation of the great transport saga. And if you want to watch the videos early, see some exclusive behind-the-scenes content, or just support the channel, consider joining our Patreon community. Fast flights on large planes, and soft landings to you.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.